In the presidential campaign of 1992, Bill Clinton promised to, quote, end welfare as we know it. Legislation was passed and reforms were instituted. And as we look today at the results, the words of President John F. Kennedy in his inaugural address come to mind. As President Kennedy said, quote, if a free society cannot help the many who are poor, it cannot save the few who are rich. Did welfare reform work? In an attempt to answer that question, New York Times senior writer Jason DeParle, who was twice a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on the welfare system, spent 7 years immersed in the lives of 3 strong women in Milwaukee, Angela Job, Jewel Reed, and Opal Caples. He examined their struggles to get out of poverty and to capture the American dream. His book, American Dream, 3 Women, 10 Kids, and a Nation's Drive to End Welfare, is captivating, inspiring, and enlightening, and shows at both the policy and the very human levels how far this nation has to go. Mr. DeParle will be signing books at the museum store immediately following this evening's forum. Joining him today are 3 of the best minds in this country on improving the lives of America's poor people. All of these men were deeply involved in the welfare reform debate. David Ellwood, beside me, is the recently named Dean of the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Dean Ellwood is a labor economist who was Assistant Secretary of Health and Human Services under President Clinton and co-chair of President Clinton's efforts on welfare reform. A key framer of the Republican bill which ultimately was supported by President Clinton is sitting beside David Ellwood. His name's Ron Haskins. He's here with us today. Mr. Haskins spent 14 years on the staff of the House Ways and Means Human Resources Subcommittee, where he was welfare counsel and then staff director. He also served under President George W. Bush in 2002 as senior advisor on welfare policy. Mr. Haskins is now a senior fellow in the Economic Studies Department at the Brookings Institute. And moderating today's discussion is the nation's most eminent poverty scholar, Dr. William Julius Wilson. Professor Wilson is director of the Joblessness and Urban Poverty Research Program at Harvard's Kennedy School. He holds one of only 17 university professorships at Harvard, which is the university's highest professorial distinction. He is past president of the American Sociological Society and has received 32 honorary degrees. He has also been named a MacArthur Fellow and has been selected by Time magazine as one of America's 25 most influential people. Before turning this over to Professor Wilson, I want to read you just a few sentences from Mr. DeParle's book, because I was so struck by his finding that people thrown off welfare were more than willing to work, and to work at low-paid, multiple jobs just to make ends meet. As Jason DeParle wrote, what really stands out about Angie and Jewel is how little they felt they were owed. They went through life acting entitled to nothing, not heat or lights, not medical care, not even 3 daily meals, and they scarcely complained. When welfare was there for the taking, they got on the bus and took it. When it wasn't, they made other plans. In ending welfare, the country took away their single largest source of income. They didn't lobby or sue. They didn't march or riot. They made their way against the odds into wearying, underpaid jobs. And that does now entitle them to something, to a shot at the American dream, more promising than the one they've received. Professor Wilson, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. You know, as we all know, Bill Clinton signed a largely Republican-drafted welfare reform bill in 1996. And this bill and the recent changes in the welfare programs of nearly every state constitute the greatest shift in social policy for low-income families since the Social Security Act of 1935. Now, Jason, on the dust jacket of your new book are the words, quote, supporters said the law would, quote unquote, liberate the poor and bring them new dignity. Opponents warned of abandoned children sleeping on grates, quote unquote. Now, as you reflect on the issues raised in your book and your considerable knowledge of welfare reform, who was more correct, the opponents or supporters, the liberals or conservatives?
I won't dodge the question. I'll say conservatives, because the primary question, I think, was whether or not women leaving the rolls would be able to work. The issues of whether the work would liberate them, I think, was a secondary issue. And on the primary issue of whether or not women, long-term welfare recipients, were employable, I think the conservatives were proved more correct than the liberals. And I say that as someone who was a skeptic of that at the time. The employment rates of low-skilled women shot way, way up, and it wasn't just because of the economy. The main woman I write about is a woman named Angela Job, who was on the rolls for 12 years, had no high school education, and within 6 months of the new law passing was a full-time steady worker. Now, her life didn't get transformed the way Ron Haskins promised us it would be. He was wrong about that, but he was right that she was more employable than those of us who were skeptical thought.
Ron, what do you think?
Well, I certainly agree that conservatives are more right. Demonstrably, the bill did exactly what it said it was going to do. That the bill said that if you create conditions that make it worthwhile for people to work and have very strong requirements, including strong sanctions to force people to work if they resist, that they will work. And when they work, they will be better off. I would hasten to point out, though, that part of the reason is right here on my right. I'm very uncomfortable to have David Ellwood on my right, but I'll have to live with it, I guess. And that is the Earned Income Tax Credit was expanded on several occasions, and in many states, the Earned Income Tax Credit, even states that don't have their own Earned Income Tax Credit, the Earned Income Tax Credit is worth more than welfare. So in the bargain, when mothers took low-wage jobs, and they were not generally minimum-wage jobs, they're roughly $7.50 or $8 an hour, they got up to this year, $4,300 in Earned Income Tax Credit. Medicaid was dramatically changed, so at least the kids would have Medicaid coverage, and the mother would have at least a year, in some states more than that. And there were tons of child care money. We've approximately doubled the amount of money for child care since 1995. So there were a number of things that liberals have fought for that were background conditions and were insufficiently attended to during the debate that Republicans continually tried to talk about and say mothers will be better off if they take these low-wage jobs. So clearly they are better off now. And I would add one thing, which is...
I'm not sure they're demonstrably better off. I'd take issue with you there. Having credited you for being right that they could work, I'm not sure I would say they're demonstrably better off.
Deny the data. The data are very clear. They could not be clearer. If you look at Census Bureau data, untouched by Republican hands, the Census Bureau shows that starting in 1993, it's just perfectly orderly data. The income from welfare for low-income mothers, all mothers below $21,000 a year, declined every year. And their income from earnings plus the Earned Income Tax Credit increased every year. The child poverty rate among female-headed families fell to the lowest point ever by far, fell every year. And even now with the recession, the increase in child poverty in female-headed families is about half of what it has been in previous recessions. So they are better off. I realize that in your book, the three mothers that you talk about are not better off, but if you look at the Census Bureau statistics, which I think are, in this one little respect, better than your book, they are better off.
Well, I'm not sure they are, actually, because Census Bureau data leave out a lot of things. Like, as you know better than me, they leave out, for one thing, work expenses, and they don't account health insurance. So one of the women I wrote about got a job and went to work, wound up having her wages garnished because she had bleeding ulcers. She's working. Her income on paper, as far as the Census Bureau is concerned, is higher. but her wages are getting garnished because she doesn't have health insurance. So it's not at all clear that any government data set is a reliable source of economic hardship. Now, I'm not saying she's worse off. I think it's largely a wash, or on balance, people are maybe a little bit better off. But I don't. You said they're demonstrably better off. And one thing that I found that surprised me about working these mothers leaving welfare, going into the low-wage workforce, was just how much hardship they had. I wasn't prepared to find so much hunger among successful workers. I mean, the two women I wrote about are both rank in the top fifth of people leaving the welfare rolls in terms of their earnings. You know, they're the top quintile, and both of them more than once ran out of food. One of the things I discovered was a lot of the fights in the household were really fights about food. They seemed like they were fights about something else, but then you realize it was 9 o'clock at night and nobody had eaten. So I disagree with you, Ron, about how reliable government data is there.
David, I really would like to get in here, but I'll let you go.
No, I'd actually like to hear you first, Bill. So why don't you go? I'll have plenty of opportunity.
I'm supposed to be the moderator, but I want to say something. First of all, let me just say that the timing of the passage of the welfare reform legislation could not have been better. You know, it occurred in a period that includes strong economic growth, extremely low unemployment rates, increases in the minimum wage, and expansion of the earned income tax credit. We're talking about the period from 1996 to 2000, all of which enlarged the employment and earnings of poor families overall and facilitated the movement off welfare. So I just wanted to underscore that the timing of welfare reform couldn't have been better. Now, however, the economy is sluggish. Poverty rates are rising again, and the number of those in the poorest of the poor category has increased significantly. And a recent Children Defense Fund study revealed that today there are more black children living in deep poverty than at any time since such data have been collected. And finally, an Urban Institute study just released reveals that up to 1/2 of those who left welfare had difficulty providing food for their children. So I just wanted to put that, present those arguments because I'm not so sure that the conservatives had it right. David?
Well, I'm here at the right table, and I should say that I was in the Clinton administration for the first 2.5 years, but I'd left before the welfare reform bill passed, and as Jason notes in his book, I did an op-ed in the New York Times strongly asking Clinton to not to sign it. Let me say a couple things. First of all, I bristle often at the description of welfare reform as just that act. Certainly within the administration and in general, I think what people have said is there were 3 really critical elements of welfare reform. One was make work pay. It started with a simple notion, if you work, you shouldn't be poor. That part came out, as Ron said, pretty much the way those who were on the left wanted it to come out. There were dramatic, huge increases in support, for working poor families. There was a second element which involved more child support enforcement, and the third was the welfare reform bill, which turned out was focused on work the way both sides had wanted, but didn't have any work-based safety net. At the end of the day, there were no guaranteed jobs for people if they couldn't find a job, and that was the big difference between where things were. That said, that combination of things ended up, I believe, of what actually passed, working a lot better than those on the left, including myself, had expected. I would have been, I can't imagine anyone having predicted dramatic reductions in poverty rates, the huge increases in work that we saw outside the home, and other kinds of activities. So I think on the sort of surface level, I just have to, I guess on this debate side is more with Ron than anything else. But I actually think the far more important point of where we are now is Jason's book and other kinds of things. Now, Jason looks at, in some sense, the some of the most extreme cases, the cases that everybody thought might be very difficult, the sort of ghetto poverty cases, which aren't representative even of people on welfare. But what he finds is that life prior to welfare was exceptionally complicated, exceptionally hard. You know, the notion that people are hungry after welfare reform, well, they were hungry before it, too. Life being poor, struggling to get ahead and so forth. People hated the welfare system because it didn't really, it created all kinds of barriers and incentives and humiliation and isolation and stigmatization. And that was a tough, miserable life that you lived from paycheck to paycheck. And yes, you worked on the side because you couldn't possibly survive if you didn't. You looked for other sources of support and so on. And after welfare reform, it's about the same. You do a little more work than you used to. And by the way, work is more rewarding because of the Earned Income Tax Credit, and we've made it better. And indeed, well prior to welfare reform, if you went to work fully or full-time at a typical state, you get $2,000 more a year, and you'd lose your Medicaid. After all these things, it was $7,000 more, and you'd keep your Medicaid, at least your kids would. But still, at the end of the day, it's extremely difficult and tough life. And I think the biggest disappointment, what we really ought to be focused on the next round, is that the biggest hope of everyone was that when we got people into the labor force, and we did, much more so than many expected, people would start moving up. They would start getting out of poverty. The goal wasn't to take people who are a little bit below poverty and push them a little bit above, because I think that's more or less what happened. The goal was to start people on a life where they would actually begin to really get in a position where they can realistically support themselves and their families. And I think at best the jury is still out on that, and at worst it's starting to look like we have really serious problems. Above and beyond that, there remains the smaller group that everyone always anticipated there would be, I suspect, of folks that find it very difficult to work, either for a variety of reasons, and some good, some bad. But those people obviously are in much worse shape in this new world. But make no mistake, welfare reform actually spent more money on the poor, not less, but it changed it. It stopped spending support for the non-working poor and converted that support to the working poor. In so doing, it made people a little better off, but it didn't fundamentally change any lives that I can tell.
David, you were talking about the trajectory of the next generation's lives. That was one of the surprises for me, was that mothers who became successful workers, we thought of them as role models, that more of their success, one of the surprises for me was that more of their success didn't translate into progress for their kids. Clinton used to he told one story, probably told it 20 times as president, about a woman named Lily Hardin, who he had met when he was the governor of Arkansas. She had come off the welfare program in Arkansas and gotten a job, and he asked her what was the best thing about being off welfare. And the way Clinton used to tell it, he said, she looked me in the eye and she said, now when my boy goes to school and they ask him what your mama does, he can give an answer. This was the heart of welfare reform to Clinton. The passion that he felt for it was that we were going to change the life course of the next generation. What he didn't seem to understand about that particular case was that the teenage son that he was talking about went to jail for a shooting. Between the time that Governor Clinton told the story and the time that President Clinton retold the story, Lily Hardin's son went to jail. He continued to tell it 20 times as president. The guy is now 30 years old and has a rap sheet longer than my pants leg. We called the North Little Rock police department to try to find out his record. It became, excuse me, I'm trying to get some records on Carlton Hardin, and so, oh yeah, we got him. I said, well, wait a minute, let me make sure you got the right Carlton Hardin. Let me give you the data. Oh no, we know Carlton. He's a known drug offender in North Little Rock. So, that's one story of a successful worker whose success didn't translate into a different new life for her kids. I found the same thing with the women I followed, and I think the data of how kids are doing in adolescence that David's referring to, that actually adolescents tend to do on average a little worse as their mothers go to work, perhaps because they just are left with that much time alone.
Didn't Lily Hardin have 2 children?
She had 4 kids.
And one of her daughters got straight A's and went to college and graduated?
She didn't graduate, no.
But she got straight A's in high school and went to college?
One of her daughters went to college. But
well, I mean, that's relevant to the story. Let me make a few comments about your response and Jason's as well. Sure. In a forum like this, you would think that we would be more concerned about data sources and the, empirical evidence than in a story about 3 mothers, although it's a terrific story, and I think there's a lot of truth in it and so forth, which I hope we'll discuss in a few moments, and something issued by the Children's Defense Fund, which is one of the most left-wing lobbying organizations in Washington, D.C., and a lot of things that they publish are extremely one-sided.
But it was, based on census data.
Not so. I cannot believe that. First of all, from your own university, two of the most respected scholars in the country, Winship and Jenks, have just published a very elaborate report of hunger in the United States, and they specifically conclude that hunger is down, that it declined more than in previous, this was during the 90s, and that it was in part because of welfare reform, because of work by mothers. There is no evidence that hunger is greater today than it was in the 80s or 90s. Now, let me make a point here that's very important, and Professor Wilson, I'd like your response to this. Professor Wilson mentioned that poverty increased, which is true. We've had 3 consecutive years of poverty increases. After those 3 consecutive years of poverty increases, poverty had fallen so much that the poverty rate today, after 3 consecutive years of increases, is much less than the average of the 80s or the average of the 90s. So we're nowhere near to going back as high as we were before welfare reform was passed. And it is clearly in the Census Bureau data because of earnings of mothers, which continue to be, it's not even comparable to, say, 1993 or 1994. So the basic idea of requiring work, and then, as David said, subsidizing work through the Earned Income Tax Credit, and I think, and you explicitly raise this in your book, that we could do more of it, that's part of a future agenda to provide more support to low-income working families, and I think we could do that. But I don't see we need to pay attention to the data here and say that what we have done is working very well, even during this, as you put a little bit unusual recession, and maybe we'll have a bad recession that'll really knock these young mothers out of the saddle. That could happen, but it has not so far.
As usual, Ron, your comments are very thoughtful. But let me just say that right now we have very little job growth, and we don't know what the foreseeable future will hold in terms of job growth. People are quite pessimistic about the state of the economy. I wonder what the situation is going to look like 5-6 years from now. And I think, most of the data that we collected with respect to welfare and experiences on welfare were during this economic boom period, you see. And so I think that, what you say is true, but I think that we ought to recognize that conditions could get a lot worse if the economy doesn't improve.
I guess I would just, David Ellwood again, I guess I would again say, in some sense, I feel like we're fighting the last war. I do think, more people are working, incomes are up somewhat, there's a lot more support for working folks. I think if we have a really serious recession, that will be make things harder. I definitely think as we've withdrawn support from non-working folks, that's a huge problem. But to me, the real question is, look, anybody that thought, and those of us, I guess some of us can be accused of it, that thought changing welfare by itself will fundamentally transform the lives of poor folks was at best naive and at worst dangerous. These are very complicated lives stitched together with a variety of different situations, and the problems are explained by things much deeper than the welfare system. So changing the welfare system may be a start towards something, and it may also make some people worse off. But fundamentally the question still remains, what do we do to start moving people up in a situation where they can really get some control, really gain some opportunity and so forth? And I think whether welfare on net was a success or not, I think it was. I really do, and I was a critic also. But have we fundamentally transformed the lives of poor folks, and what do we need to do next? What do we need to do to really begin people moving upwards more quickly and more effectively? Get them not just slightly above the poverty line, but well above it. I think that's the real challenge that we face. And so, again, and I think if the economy turns sour, that's going to be incredibly tough. Right. I think we have a lot of work to do.
So give us your agenda.
I wish I had
forward-looking agenda.
Well, I think the starting point is how do you think about creating job ladders now? We got people to the first rung, and I think we did better on that than a lot of us than a lot of people thought we would. There are a few people that are worse off, I'm sure. But the question is, how do you build the next ladder and move up from there? And I think that the old-style job programs that are sort of separate, disembodied, and so forth, the kinds of things, frankly, that you wrote about quite effectively, Jason, in W2 and so on, and your jobs program, just don't work. What you got to have is training programs and so forth that are closely connected with real employers and real jobs and so forth that are designed to move up. And here's one place where I disagree, maybe very slightly, with Professor Wilson. And that is, we're coming up ahead. We have a period where there's very slow growth in the population. Very, very slow growth in the population. That means we're going to need every worker we've got. And that's why, as a nation, it will be all the more important for us to focus on training and support and upgrading the skills of some workers that traditionally hadn't been very traditional. And so I actually think we're kind of on a knife edge. We have a moment coming up where we're going to need workers, but we're going to need pretty skilled workers. The kinds of workers that Jason wrote about aren't going to fill those jobs. So we got a choice. We can let the employers go abroad to get their workers, or we can figure out a way to try and upgrade the skills and the opportunities of those.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to move to another question. As you know, before September 30th, Congress has to decide whether the welfare reform law should be extended. And the original legislation stipulated that the welfare reform bill would expire after 5 years unless Congress voted to reauthorize it. And one of the issues to be reviewed is whether the work requirements for welfare recipients are strong enough. Indeed, members of Congress, including some Democratic liberals like Hillary Clinton, have backed legislation calling for tougher work requirements for welfare recipients. What position? I'd like to get your take on this, Ron, and then get the responses of others.
The legislation that passed in '96 had an obscure little provision that was inserted toward the end called a caseload reduction credit. And in accord with this provision, any state that reduced its caseload compared to 1994 would be able to count that reduction as work participation. And the legislation required a 50% work participation rate. So if you had 1,000 people on AFDC, you would have 500 in employment programs. But if your caseload was down by 300, now you have 500 minus 300 are only 200. And it turned out that the caseload all around the country declined by an average of 60%. Some states a little more, some states a little less. But that meant that the average work requirement, which was supposed to be 50%, was around 7 or 8% in the typical state, and many states it was 0. So that is the problem that the legislation was intended to create. Now, I will be the first to admit, and I worked in administration at the time, that it hasn't exactly worked out as planned. But the 70% and some other adjustments in the definition of work and so forth. But I want to tell you that I think that on Capitol Hill that's worked out, and both sides are happy. It will in fact be a 50% requirement, which is what we supposedly put in the law in '96. There will be some changes in definition the liberals don't like very much, but even those have been modified, and I think there could be some more modification. The biggest problem is, and the reason the bill is not passed yet to reauthorize the legislation, is because Democrats and a number of Republicans in the Senate want more money for child care. They want around $5 billion for child care, and Republicans on the Hill administration are only willing to give $1 billion. Now, under most circumstances, that would be a no-brainer. You put Ellwood and Haskins in a room, and an hour later we come out and we had our calculators and computers and everything. Let's see, 1 and 5. 3, how about 3? Let's do 3. And that's normally what would happen. But because of the atmosphere on Capitol Hill and the very severe financial crunch for many reasons, including too much spending and reduction in income, taxes, this is a huge issue. But that is the issue that's holding it up. I think everything else can be settled except that one issue.
And I should say that that Hillary Clinton indicated that she supported the legislation for tougher welfare work requirements because she was hopeful to build in this child care provision associated with that.
Can I say something about this? I think it's absolutely tragic that we're even having this debate about work participation rates. Ron and I agree about this. This is such a wasted opportunity. Look, 10 years ago, the country was just tearing its hair out about welfare. Ted Kennedy was running anti-welfare ads. It was that pervasive in the culture. And we passed this law. It worked better than almost anyone expected. We've got momentum behind that we could build on for a really creative anti-poverty policy. I like to view this through the lens of diplomacy, that this is a confidence-building measure. We found something that worked a little bit, and we can take that political energy into building a real work-based safety net for these women, to support them as low-wage workers, to provide aftercare and a better trajectory for their kids, to bring the fathers back into the house, to provide the men. I mean, this has been a piece of legislation that has almost exclusively targeted one gender. There's an entire fatherhood and male income agenda, should be an economic agenda, an emotional agenda of reconnecting with the kids. There's all these things that probably all of us on this panel would have large areas of agreement with, and instead Congress is debating this esoteric thing called the caseload reduction credit and what percentage of the caseload should be involved in what are often rinky-dink activities defined as work. It's just a huge wasted opportunity.
I just would like to agree with Jason, but I think it's more than a wasted opportunity. I think it's actually a worrisome development. This bill worked a lot better than anybody expected, but a lot different also. The truth is, states had a lot of extra money to spend on welfare recipients because they were given a block grant that didn't change no matter how much their caseload went down. And so they had a lot of money, and a lot of states did a lot of things to try and help people move from welfare to work and so forth. It varied, but they did a lot. And the work requirements never came into force, and yet we had this incredible success that we've talked about. Now we say, oh, we screwed up. We got the caseloads down by 60%. We've got what's left is a much more difficult situation and so forth. And what we're going to do is reduce the money and insist that everybody do make work or bizarre kinds of things and so forth. And by the way, if they can't, they have to be thrown off because we're not going to guarantee jobs or anything. We're at a time when there's a recession. I'm with Jason on this. Look, this thing worked actually a lot better than people expected. And so now we're going to say, I know, we just need to ramp it up and really do what we meant the first time. And my fear is we may get what we really feared the first time after this. And the real focus, again, ought to be on the kinds of things Jason said. I agree also, by the way, about the men. I think that ultimately what we want to do is find ways for families to be more stable, more successful, more effective. And that's partly about empowering both men and women in a way that gives them a real chance to move forward. So I think that this has the potential for really serious consequences. That's from someone who said the last one had potential for serious consequences, I will admit. But I also want to point out that, in fact, the bill did not work at all how the conservatives thought it would, and now they want it to work the way they said the first time. So we'll see.
Okay, thanks. Another question. Some policymakers have argued that more dollars from TANF, that's temporary assistance for needy families, more dollars from TANF should be spent on programs for poor parents who marry. Others have argued that rather than promoting marriage by focusing on values and improving relational skills and so on, TANF money should go towards making poor parents, especially fathers, more marriageable in a sense of obtaining employment and being able to support their families. What is your position on this, David? Considering your research?
Right, well, my recent work, indeed, part of my view about sort of what we're ultimately going to happen about poverty is we can't figure out something about the ways to make families work more effectively and partnerships more successful, as well as deal with wage inequality, we're going to have real trouble. I've been looking a lot at what's been driving the changes in family structure and so forth, and it's really quite striking. I think a lot of the story has to do with what happens to men and women when they have children and their opportunities and so on. I don't want to get into it in great detail except to say this. When a low-income woman when a high education woman has a child, it actually has a quite profound effect on her earnings. And it's part of the reason I suspect that high-income women are postponing childbearing, often avoiding it altogether, or high education. Less educated women, their wages were flat to begin before, and they're flat afterwards. It doesn't change it very much. Those women often have children very early. But when you look at what's happened to the men in those settings, if you look at what an 18 or 19 or 20-year-old man who is a high school dropout and so forth does in this economy, it's a disaster. And so ultimately, the way I think to strengthen families is actually to strengthen the economic opportunities of both men and women. Give women a reason to postpone and men a reason to be a party of the whole operation. So I really think that's the focus. Values, marriage, education, and so forth, fine, but ultimately the goal is to strengthen the economic base for families. As Jason put it, a lot of the fights and a lot of the problems and so forth are around economic stress. I think the earned income tax credit is probably as responsible as anything for some of the improvements we've seen in family structure.
So are you against the Bush marriage plan?
Again, I think it's more of a distraction than anything else. I'd really like to focus on issues of putting men to work and giving women more opportunities.
Let me, at the risk of being wrong, which is probably at least a 90% certainty, because I'm going to disagree with David Ellwood, but there is a very strong case for marriage. If we had the same marriage rate in the United States,
I want to make sure I wasn't against marriage. Let me just be real clear. I'm in favor.
Well, you said the marriage
marriage
initiative was a distraction more than anything else. I believe that's a quote.
I did not say marriage is a distraction. I said the marriage initiative because I don't.
Well, okay, all right.
You have to
let me continue then, and let's let the audience decide what they think about whether we need to have some new policies and some new efforts here. If we had the marriage rate in our country that we had in 1970, poverty would drop by almost 30%. The single biggest cause of the difficulty that we've had, despite enormous increases in welfare programs during the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, is that the increased rate of non-marital births and the fall of marriage rates played a huge role. So what we need to do is to figure out how to encourage marriage. And read Jason's book. I strongly recommend his book, plus the article in the New York Times Magazine a couple of weeks ago, the cover story about Ken, who is deeply involved with one of the mothers that Jason tells about, Jewel. And Jewel is madly in love with Ken. Ken is as much in love with Jewel as he's probably capable of, but he's madly in love with his son. And another thing that Jason tells in this book over and over again is how the kids miss their fathers, and many of the fathers say they want to do right by their children. In our society, and probably in almost every society, the only way to truly do right by your children is to be married to their mother, to be faithful to their mother, to help provide for the family. There is no other way to do it. In some cases, in upper middle class families, fathers can maintain contact, and they can send money, and they can meet the responsibilities somewhat. But marriage is a key here. Now, we don't have the faintest idea how to promote marriage. And the Bush agenda is to spend money doing large-scale demonstrations, give it to guys like David Ellwood at Harvard and William Julius Wilson, and have them do random assignment experiments and offer services to the fathers so they can learn employment skills and so forth, and see if somebody can figure this out, that we could create the ability of low-income families to marry. And let me add one thing. We now know for certain, based on research done by a colleague of ours at Princeton named Sarah McClanahan, wonderful research all around the country. I've never seen even mediocre denial of her findings, which is that half of these young couples that have children outside marriage already live together. Something like 80% of them consider themselves romantically involved, and the mother and the father talk openly about being married. But they hesitate, and probably for good reason. I'm not criticizing them for hesitating. But with a situation like that, you would think that if we could provide supports to the mothers and the fathers, and especially the fathers, we might be able to get somewhere. And all the Bush plan says is, let's try it. Let's give the state some money and the university some money. Let's do large-scale demonstrations and see if we can help these young people stay together and support each other and their children.
David, you know I hate agreeing with Ron, but what's the matter with what he's saying?
I can't disagree that A, marriage can work very well, and B, that I'm all in favor of social experimentation and so forth within reason. But again, I think to understand the sort of larger forces and so on, part of the problem is that a lot of what actually comes out is a lot about changing values and changing norms and so forth. I think the reason that Jewel and Ken worked out so well and so forth is not because they went to a parenting class. And I think the chances of them really making it will increase many-fold if the opportunities that the two of them face and so on. So this is one where Ron and I can be put in a room and we really would agree quickly, I think, on some ideas. But I think the real question here is, how do you find ways to make stable and attractive families? Let me add one other thing. Talked about Sarah McClanahan's work. She actually is very clear that actually the critical thing is being with your biological parents. And so the challenge isn't just marriage, and the challenge is not good marriage or bad marriage, whatever, which is another huge issue. The challenge is really to find ways so that both parents can stay with their children and nurture them. And that's an enormous challenge in the kind of complex world, Jason, that you find and that we work with. And again, so I can't oppose in any way the notion that we should do some experiments and so forth. But again, I think the question is, what do we focus on?
Just to say one thing about fathers, that was one of the big surprises for me in following the women, was how profound a yearning there was for the kids for their fathers, and even for the women who for the fathers. The three mothers I followed, they hadn't grown up with their fathers. One of them becomes a nursing aide, and it's a very difficult job caring for. She works in a nursing home, caring for very, very infirm people. And I was trying to figure out what had drawn it to her when other kinds of low-wage work paid as well or better. There's some ethnographies of nursing home workers that describe what motivates them, and it's often a non-economic reward. Just that they enjoy the experience of being a caretaker. So I had this kind of theory about Angie, and usually when I had my theories about Angie, she would look at me with this sort of face that looked like she was sucking a lemon and just give me this, "You're so stupid" look whenever I would float one of these by her. And this time, before I could even get it out, she said, "I'll tell you why I became a nursing aide. It's because of my daddy." And in his case, he was a terrible alcoholic who died. She hadn't seen him in several years, saw him for the last time after, and he had really declined in these years, and then he died shortly after, and she felt terribly guilty that she hadn't taken care of him. So in her case, she changes her whole life, she chooses her occupation out of some yearning to reconnect with this lost father of hers, this alcoholic father. Her daughter, in turn, her daughter's father, her boyfriend, is in jail basically for life, serving a life sentence for murder. And the daughter chooses a high school with a pre-law program. Poor Keisha, she's a terrible student. She's got bad asthma. It requires her to take a bus all the way across town. It's actually a demerit to her education for her to go to this high school, but she chooses it because it's got a pre-law program and she wants to get her father out of jail. I mean, there's 10 other stories like that where just the yearning, the profound yearning, not just for an economic support of a man, but for the emotional attachment with their biological father, continues to shape the course of their life.
Bill, you're the world's leading expert on some of this stuff, or why don't you comment on it?
Well, I just want to say, David, that I agree with you. That is, it is a distraction. Our research certainly supports the idea that jobless men really adversely affect family relations. Not enough attention is given to the plight of men. You mentioned that we should provide job opportunities for both men and women. I agree. And the research does reveal that women who are working, men and women who are working, are far more likely to marry. And I think this is really a fundamental issue that is not receiving much discussion in Congress. Now, I would agree with Ron that we should have some programs on marriage education and values and so on. I would just like to combine such programs with systematic efforts to improve the employment opportunities of low-skilled men and women, particularly those in the inner city.
Let me just say that's exactly what I just said we needed to do. We definitely, it should not just be marriage education. Look, all of us have grown up in a time when program evaluation came of age. And I can remember back in the 60s, we all thought, oh, we're going to have a summer program for these little kids. We're going to teach them their numbers and letters, and they are going to turn into scholars. And they're going to do just fine in public schools. And now we know 30 years later, 40 years later, it is extremely difficult. Intervention programs generally do not work. So do I think that we're going to have values clarification and marriage education and all these young couples are going to run out and get married? Absolutely not. It's way deeper than that. That's why we need to have these large-scale experiments, and they should specifically include activities with the fathers, including employment. But I would point out to you, Professor Wilson, that in the McClanahan research, the average income of the fathers that wind up on average is about $16,000. So it's not like they're the down and out ones that we know so much about and read about in Jason's book and other books. On average, they do have jobs. They're not great jobs, but they have some jobs. So I agree with everything you said, but it goes beyond just. But
isn't this the conversation you'd like Congress to be having about
Absolutely.
How much of it should be economic, how much of it should be peer support groups for low-income men that to talk about how to talk to each other about how to be better fathers? I mean, this is the kind of conversation I wish Congress was having instead of being in this really nasty debate over whether the work participation rate should be 72.3%.
I think we did have that conversation, and I think that the media in the country, much to their credit, including the Washington Post, that almost never agrees with anything the Republicans recommend, said, the Bush initiative that I just described makes some sense. Let's try it. And I think we had this debate in Congress, and basically the people that were hostile to it in the beginning, especially when there were some adjustments made on the issue of violence, which is extremely important, that women need to be protected and that sort of thing, that I think that there is bipartisan agreement now, and whatever we pass, if we ever pass a damn bill, it will have this initiative in it. Both sides agree to that. We're hung up over the daycare money. That's it.
Okay, very good. Jason, I'll give you a chance to elaborate a little bit more on your book. Our research on welfare reform reveals significant differences across different groups of women who have left TANF, some of whom have done much better than the average, some of whom have done much worse. We found that women with lower levels of education, with poorer health, with younger children, and who are themselves young, had considerably lower rates of employment and levels of income after leaving welfare than did women with the opposite circumstances. And in the group of those with the longest periods on welfare, employment rates and incomes were considerably lower than average. They subsisted by relying on money from friends and family, cutting back on necessities, and delaying paying bills. Now, where would you place the women in your study in terms of this description? Are they representative of those that have done much better than average, or of those that have done much worse?
I followed 3 women who are not representative of all low-income single mothers, and they're not representative even of all welfare mothers. I think they are, broadly speaking, representative of the long-term inner-city welfare poor, and I think that's really what the political debate was about. So I think politically they connect to the emotions, to the heart of the debate, to the crux of the problem. And they all 3 would fit the definition of a long-term recipient. What surprised me is the one who seemed most likely to succeed had the worst problems. On the surface, she had a high school degree, She had some work experience. She even had a semester at community college, and she had been married. All those things would predict a more likely employment success than the other two women who had never been married, had no high school degree. One had been on for 12 years, one had been on for 8. The problem was the woman with the seeming advantages also was addicted to crack cocaine, which I didn't know and a lot of other people didn't know. But I think there's something of a lesson in there that success is sort of hard to predict at the outset. I think that's a lesson that lots of program administrators have found. A kind of upfront screening where you decide who's going to succeed and who isn't, and who needs more remediation. By and large, that's a very imperfect process. And usually what they find works better is to send people out for 4 or 6 weeks of job search, and you'd be surprised at sort of which ones do and which ones have the hidden problems like the woman I got to know.
David?
I think that, as I say, the thing I really like about Jason's book is that it's rich with the sort of complexity and the struggles and of 3 people really trying their very best to get ahead before things changed and afterwards. I think, as I think Ron said as well, they are certainly not representative of welfare women. There is no such thing. They are probably more representative of the long term, but even there, they moved from Chicago to Milwaukee specifically to get higher benefits. At least scholars find very little evidence of that beyond a few places like that.
Did you say scholars find
very little evidence of lots of welfare mobility? And I'm fond of saying that every welfare administrator I've ever met thinks their state's a welfare magnet. And there's
in Mississippi,
certain adding up constraint there. And so I think in some sense the lives there are somewhat more complex and so perhaps at times more disconnected. But that said, I think that I really enjoyed the book a lot, and I found the richness and the complexity there, and so on. And as I say, what Jason found for me, and I wish he should speak for himself, was a set of very complicated lives beforehand, and a set of also complicated lives after that were maybe on average a little bit better, but not very much, and that fundamentally were unchanged.
At one point, I asked Angie, the main character, I don't know, the 77th question about welfare. What were you thinking about welfare on Tuesday? What were you thinking about welfare on Wednesday? And she finally looked up at me and she said, "Welfare? That's your crazy stuff." You're thinking about welfare. I'm not thinking about welfare. I'm thinking about the 78 other things in my life. And one way to view her, on the one hand, you can look at her life like everything changed, right? She'd been on welfare for 12 years. She gets off. She's got a new job. She goes from welfare to work. Just the whole phrase is kind of pregnant with possibility. It seems like it's an upward trajectory. A different way of describing the same, she gets a 401k. I mean, imagine the speech somebody could give off the rolls, on the job, 401k. A different way to talk about her life is that before the law passed, she was a low-income single mother raising kids by herself in a dangerous inner-city neighborhood in chaotic circumstances without support of a man. And she goes through all these changes, and after it's all over, she's a low-income single mother raising, it's the same life. She's got the same life. So I think if you tell either half, you're missing it. I mean, if you say nothing changed, you're missing it, because something did change. And if you say, God, everything changed in her life, look, she's off to a new life, then you're missing it too. You got to calibrate those two thoughts, and it was a struggle for me constantly to figure out which one to put more emphasis on, to where to see the success and where to see the failure, where to start to see something changing and where it wasn't. That's hard to know.
Well, with the obvious exceptions of The Truly Disadvantaged, written by Professor Wilson, and Poor Support, written by Professor Ellwood, I would nominate this book as one of the best books ever written about welfare, and it's precisely for the reason that Jason mentioned a minute ago, and that is that it shows that both sides were wrong in some sense, that a mother could go to work and do exactly, as he says several times in the book, what the legislation required mothers to do. And we disagree a little bit. I think her economic situation improved somewhat, and certainly on average they definitely improved somewhat, but they still are low-income single mother and all this sort of thing. The one hope that I have is that changing these patterns will require more than just 5 years or 10 years. They will require a generation, and that children eventually will respond, and especially if by some experimentation or whatever, change of values, that we end up having more fathers in the picture supporting the mother and supporting the children, especially if they live together in a household. In fact, as Ken and...
Let me tell one story. That the book actually traces, the three women are cousins, and it traces their family history back into slavery. So it starts with a common ancestor 6 generations back, and it traces their story from slavery through sharecropping. So it's definitely written with the tragedy of racial history in our country in mind. And at the end of my time in Milwaukee, I went for a ride with an eccentric Milwaukee liberal named John Gardner, and he was likening the end of welfare to the period after slavery, where freedmen were roaming the countryside, hungry, bruised, sick, searching for a new life, and I thought, gee, how hyperbolic! How could you? I mean, whatever AFDC was, it wasn't slavery. And so I dismissed this comparison, but I never quite forgot it, because it reminded me of how hard it can be to understand or to spot success when it's just unfolding before you. I mean, it would have been easily to say in 1867 or 1868, to argue by analogy, that, gee, emancipation didn't work. Look at all these hungry people. But it took 100 years or more for us to be confident that we were truly on a moving on a trajectory towards real freedom for African Americans. Well, in this case, in welfare, for welfare recipients of all different colors, maybe it's just too early to know what trajectory we're on. No, not as much change as I would have hoped, but clearly something did change in Angie's life, something positive, and I have to cling to the hope that there's something more to come.
Don't forget the voices you heard, though, Jason, which were basically reminded us that welfare is a single program that a lot of people get all hyped over, but it's not a single life. A single life is a rich array of a whole variety of different things, and one element of that life was changed, some for the better, perhaps, but a lot of the other forces, the much larger forces that drove those, the fundamental forces, probably weren't fundamentally changed, and almost nothing we can do with the welfare system now or in the past will really change that.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to now open it up for discussion. Just if you have a question, come to the mic in the aisle.
Hi, I'm Betty Bolke O'Gara, and I run an agency in Boston for young people who are at risk and have done so for the last 25 years. And I started out human services in Chicago when Mayor Daley was mayor, the old Mayor Daley. And I've been back to Chicago several times, and my son went to college in upstate New York. And one of my major concerns is the displaced labor force, that is a burgeoning displaced labor force. And I think the welfare debaticle or the welfare debate is wonderful, but the issue really is the displaced labor force and industry moving abroad. And I really would like more information about how policies are being developed to deal with those types of issues, because that's the basis of work and employment and education and training, and getting a job is having the jobs available. And one person did make the note that we do need every person available to work in the next 20 years, but we still have a displaced labor force. And what's your thoughts on that in conjunction with welfare reform?
Well, I was the person, David Ellwood, that made it. A couple things. I think that those who believe that welfare reform by itself, and especially the next round of welfare reform, is really going to train folks and give them an opportunity to move into new jobs and so forth, are sadly mistaken. It hasn't happened in the past. It's not going to happen. Oh, okay. Is this unable to hear me the entire time? Okay, well, what I said was...
say, but it's not necessarily better, David.
Sorry about that.
Is it the case that you haven't heard us? Oh, okay, all right.
Well, you're better off for that. What was stated was they hadn't heard me. So I think the real challenge here is to find a new set of alternatives. And I think it's more than welfare recipients, and I think that's in some ways the good news. The good news is, the bad news is yes, there have been jobs moving abroad and so forth, but the good news is the population is slowing way down. And so the real danger here is we're going to have this need for fairly high-skilled labor, and we're going to have low-skilled labor available. And so the question is, what can we as a nation do to begin to really focus on that and make those connections? And I think if we do nothing, the danger is more jobs will just go abroad and no one will ever make those connections. And I think the opportunity here is on a scale not just focused on welfare. I think that becomes, I think, on low-skilled workers in general. We really need to focus on ways to connect them into different kinds of jobs, to provide the skills to move forward and move up. And the danger is left by itself, the economy won't automatically do this, because as workers now move from job to job more quickly than ever before, the danger for an employer providing training is he's training his competitors' workforce. And so that's why we need to figure out a set of institutions and so on that will actually connect workers with real training that's really connected with real jobs, but that's within an industry. So I think kind of industry-specific training programs and others are going to be pretty essential for the future.
Okay.
Jason, I'm curious how you found the people who you wrote about.
It's a very funny story. I was in a welfare office in the summer of 1997. It was a class to teach women how to do job interviews, and it was not going well. The head of the counselor kept complaining that she wasn't qualified and wasn't prepared. There was a woman who was drunk. There was a woman eating potato chips beneath the no eating sign. There were about eight people, half of them asleep, and so the teacher, the caseworker, calls on a woman to come up and do a practice job interview. And it would take Tom Wolfe to really do justice to her walk up to the head of the class, but it was a long, loose-limbed, languid sort of pimp roll up to the front of the class, and she flopped in the chair, and the woman said, "Tell me about yourself." And she popped up and she said, "My name is Opal Caples." What makes you happy? The counselor asked. "Being around smiling people," Opal said. And it went on like all of a sudden the people woke up in the class, and the drunk woman came to life, and the woman stopped eating potato chips, and they're all going, "You go, girl, you do it, you do it." And she turned it on for about a minute, and then she just said, "But I like being on welfare," and she just turned off the juice and then kind of flip-flopped back into her chair at the back of the class. I said, "Wow, this woman is bilingual. There's something interesting going on here." So I went up to her after the class and introduced myself and started. I met her the next night. She had a little job in a hospital as in the GI lab, the gastrointestinal, cleaning the GI lab in the hospital. I followed her around, and she told me her life story in very self-deprecating terms. She talked about being in a gang, talked about cheating on welfare, talked about all sorts of things she had done. She said, "But one thing I never did was I never did drugs. Just never got into that. Lots of my friends did. I just never did that." I followed her back to her house. She had a big no drugs sign on her door. There was a guy kind of glowering at me in the living room. He had a no drugs sign on his lapel. So it's like, "I'm from the New York Times, and I can tell you there are no drugs here." Well, it was a rehab building, and Opal had just gotten out of rehab. Everybody in the building was on drugs. Opal was on drugs. The reason the guy was glowering at me was it was her boyfriend, and she'd just been binging the night before. So Opal, she was the bilingual woman was definitely living a bifurcated life. I didn't find this out for months, and through her, within 9 months of the time I met her, she was homeless and pregnant, living in a crack house with W-2 sending her the money for the crack. And after she came out of the crack house, I met the other two cousins who were taking care of her.
I have a question about the child care. I mean, I think it's good if you require women to go to work. You do provide child care, but I'm wondering, does that child care have to be institutionalized child care? And my comment to add on to that is, I believe in strengthening families, but I wonder if we can insert a little word, extended families, because most of us move so far away from our families that we don't have grandparents, we don't have aunties there to help support us with children. And I'm sorry, I'm a little nervous, but I'm concerned because of the This is not an issue that I've had to deal with personally, but in my community, the crime rate is going up. And I know that if you're requiring parents to go to work, and if in order to make ends meet, these parents are having to work 2 and 3 jobs, and so you're providing child care to stick these kids in institutions and aftercare, nobody's going to care for these kids like their families. And institutions don't raise children very well. If we could get some of that money channeled into, if you can give the same credit to somebody who's sticking their kid in an institution, if you can give that same credit to someone who's having their grandparent or their little sister or somebody take care of the children, you would also help channel some funds and some motivation and some unity into extended families and not leave that burden completely on mothers and fathers.
The federal government has had a running fight, starting actually back in the early 1970s when we passed a huge piece of legislation called the Comprehensive Child Development Act that would have brought most child care that got federal support under federal regulations and make child care meet all kinds of quality standards and would have pretty much removed the choice of parents as to what kind of care they got. The debate went on over something called the federal interagency daycare requirements, which after about 15 years were completely defeated. They too would have imposed federal standards on child care in the United States. And the debate really came to a head in 1990 when we passed major child care legislation, and the decision, part of a compromise to have money in the way the bill worked out, was that the federal government would not impose strong standards on the states. It would be up to the states and to parents. And, in addition, states would have to have vouchers available so that parents could choose child care for themselves, and the states had to tell the parents it was available. Today, 14 years later, about 80% of the federal child care dollars are spent through vouchers. And a fair amount of that money, we don't have really good data, and maybe somebody knows a better answer than I do, but a fair amount of that money is spent in neighborhoods with grandparents and other relatives because parents get a choice about how they're supposed to spend, how they want to spend their child care money. Let me add one last thing to that, and that is that a lot of professionals do not like that because they think parents choose child care on the basis of convenience and cost, and they should be choosing it on the basis of high quality with teachers with BAs and so forth. And they would like to impose federal regulations so the kids would be in higher quality care. So this debate still goes on, but under current law, the money can be used in the kind of settings that you just described, and often is.
Maya?
Hi, my name is Maya Carlson. I'm at Harvard Medical School. I was a student of David Ellwood's and Mary Jo Bain the year before they went to Washington. So I changed my career from studying brain development and the early effects of experience on brain development to try to understand how can you look at the social policy that's affecting children and therefore affecting their brain development so that they can have the best chance to get a job when they grow up, to be married, to be happy, to be good citizens. I mean, whatever it takes. I mean, it does take early experience that's supportive and that is directed towards that child. Now, it may be that their aunts, that their grandmothers, there may be some family daycare that really is money going to people who, in fact, are invested in those children and know how to do the best thing for those children. But I also am a scientist, and in the same way Mr. Haskins asked for data, we have a lot of data out of Chicago that shows something about the quality of child care. And it comes out of the same era. It comes out of the Project on Human Development in Chicago Neighborhoods, which is a big study that Felton Earls was the principal investigator for, and I assume Bill Wilson's study that includes child care in many cities will come out with the same kinds of findings. But what we found is in Chicago there are sort of 3 basic forms of institutional child care. One is the preschool program, which is supported by the state. The other is Head Start, which is huge in Chicago. For those people who came out of the Daley administration know that he got a lot of that money. And the other is unregulated. If you look at the quality of care, and the quality of care is not whether you're learning ABCs, it's about whether you are being treated, respected for your making choices, for having a point of view, being talked to in a nice way, whether the child is exposed to books, whether the child can take initiative, whether the furniture is the size of children, whether the child knows what the program's about. It's the kind of things that I paid a lot of money for to send my kids to Montessori school, and my children are paying a lot of money for to send their kids to these kind of high-quality programs. It's not institutionalized, it's community-based, and it's the kind of thing that really helps children grow, and there's a lot of evidence that it makes them go far. The evidence out of Chicago is that the kind of money that the Child Care Bureau got through welfare reform, which was without regulation, without any standards, that money goes into programs that's low quality. It's lower quality than Head Start. It's lower quality than the state preschool programs. But even more disturbing is if you look at ethnicity, if you look at the large Latino population, the large African American population, and European American population, if you just sort of imagine each of those as 1/3 of the population, for state pre-K, the quality of those programs is the same regardless of ethnic group. If you look at Head Start, the quality is higher than the money that the welfare reform puts into the Child Care Bureau, and it's the same high quality for all three ethnic groups. If you look at the money that goes into the unregulated child care, it's very poor for African Americans. It is very poor, significantly lower than for Latino Americans and for European Americans. So what you had back in the War on Poverty and what you had with the Head Start as being a program that really cared about communities, that cared about families, that cared about children, was you had a program that was developed with appreciation for the complexity of the lives that we're talking about today. These programs came out with people involved, the people who live in these communities, telling people, you know, the kind of things that you may know 3 lives. I knew 10 lives of welfare mothers for 2 years. I worked very closely with them and their 20 children. So you learn a lot from this kind of quality time and this kind of very detailed information you get. You learn a lot from the big data sets, from census or whatever. But the point is, if you want to develop programs that are going to lead to healthy children, happy children, productive children, good citizens, and a future of the workforce or of the civil society, you have to think about the complexity of raising children. And if you're putting money into a program that produces poor care and care that discriminates exclusively against African Americans, you're not doing right by this country.
Can I just comment one thing, Bill? This has been a hard question for me over the years, and one that I've been fascinated by. Is a fellow by the name of A.J. Chaudhry recently did a book that I found very helpful in this. High-quality care has many characteristics, but one of the most important actually has to do with stability. Being, you know, in a warm, supported, and positive environment, but also being able to stay there and so forth. And he followed the child care settings of a group of mothers in New York City, and found that the informal care and so forth was the preferred method of child care when the kids were very young, in part because they didn't trust the institutional kinds of care settings and so forth. But it was unbelievably unstable. That you'd go for a few days or a few weeks with one person, and then you'd move to the next. And so, and the simple truth is, aunts and mothers and sisters and so forth, loose relatives and so forth, they also had lives. They had other things they had to do. They got sick, they wanted to go away, they did other things and so on. And so the child was moving from setting to setting, perhaps 2 settings in a single day and so forth. There's really no sense of stability. Yes, there may have been love there and so forth, but the connections. And eventually, as the children got older, the mothers would eventually get them placed into more institutional type care and so forth. And this was almost always a godsend for everybody. Suddenly, it was stable. Suddenly, there was a reliable place to take children and so forth. And so I think it's easy to imagine a vision of sort of the loving grandmother and so forth. But remember, loving grandmothers are mostly working now too. And so what you actually are talking about is piecing together just another complex web of people to look after the kid this day and so forth, and someone doesn't show up and so on. And so, again, the reality is not always the quality that you might hope for. And in that setting, kind of more stable, high quality institutionally. Now here's the problem. It's a whole lot more expensive. And that's the real challenge.
You know, David, I want to take this opportunity. Since you mentioned Chaudhry's study, which is an ethnographic study, research that I'm involved in with a number of colleagues is a large survey, first of all, of the impact of welfare reform on families and children in 3 cities, San Antonio, Boston, and Chicago. But the study also includes an ethnographic component, that is field research for people out in the community spending a lot of time with these families. And we're studying 70 families in each city through ethnographic methods. And I just think, we don't capture a lot of the experiences that you're talking about with surveys and so on. And the ethnographic stuff was very revealing indeed. I think it's incredible that 1/4 of the primary caregivers in the ethnographic sample worked a full-time, low-wage job despite having serious physical and mental health problems, while providing care for children who also had health problems. A lot of these environments are very unhealthy. Flies and maggots breed all kinds of unhealthy things. Toilets are stopped up. All of these problems, rats biting helpless infants. This is what we uncover in the research. And
in childcare, in the childcare center,
no, I'm
or in
not
the home?
talking about childcare. I'm talking about the homes. I mean, I just want to just get this point out. So we have many mothers with physical and mental health problems, while providing care for children who also had health problems. And many of these mothers feel that no matter how sick they are, they have to go to work. And they tended to neglect their own physical and mental health needs while providing the economic and health care of their children and also extended family members. And then there was another group. Their wages, are often insufficient to support a household. And so many of the mothers are forced to hold 2 jobs, working as many as 70 hours a week, a burden that takes its toll physically and emotionally on the mothers, since they have little time to rest, take care of their children, or handle daily tasks. So, Maya, when you were talking, I just reminded that there are just some things about the experiences with welfare and moving off welfare that are not captured in the more quantitative studies.
Hi, my name is Andy Feldman, and I'm a graduate student and native of Milwaukee. So I'm probably the only person here who had the book sent to me by their parents for their birthday. And I'm on page about 50, and it's really interesting. So my question is for
parents here who had the book sent to them for their birthday, but
my question is for Jason, and it's after that very close look at these families and at poverty in Milwaukee. What did you find were the most interesting unanswered questions for, say, the next generation of poverty researchers, either in terms of policies that might be effective or useful, or even dynamics within families or within neighborhoods that you would like more investigation on in the future?
I used to live in I spent a year in the Philippines, living with a family in a squatter camp there. And I've stayed in touch with them in the 15 years since. And in the process of working on the book, I was in touch, getting phone calls and letters from the daughter in this family. She was 16 when I was there. She's 30 now, and she went to nursing school. She's a nurse, and her great quest is to become a nurse in the United States. So my wife and I have been involved in a years-long attempt to try to get her into the States as a nurse. And to listen to her descriptions of what coming to the United States would be like for her, she just describes it as though it would be the land of unending opportunity. It's a classic immigrant's dream to get out of the Philippines, but now she's in the Middle East as a guest worker at in the Saudi. She's been in Kuwait. She's been in United Arab Emirates working in these hospitals. So I've had the experience of the contrast between Salih, talking about the United States as just a place where her life would be so much better with the way that Angie and Jewel and Opal described their own lives, in which they described it as an empty place where there really was nothing for them. One time I was really pressing Angie about, I think I even said, "Hey Angie, it's a big prosperous country out there. What's kept you from taking full advantage of it? What is it that keeps you down?" And she kind of had an outburst and said, "You just think we came to Milwaukee because there was so much for us here, so much opportunity waiting for us here, so much we could do here, good jobs here. We didn't come for any of that stuff." Just almost an angry voice. And the mirror image of the way Salih was describing it. So to answer your question, what was most puzzling to me, it's what is it in her life that has instilled that kind of alienation, I suppose. What is it that, I mean, yes, there's economic barriers, and yes, she doesn't have the skills, and we're in a period of just deindustrialization, but there's something that seems to have gone out of her ability even to dream the American dream. The book takes its title from a Clinton quote, "I think we all know in our heart of hearts too many children never get a shot at the American dream." In Angie's case, she never dreamt it, and that's what puzzles me the most.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yes, my name's Richard Schultz, and I read, I don't know if it was a book or an article a year or 2, 3 years ago that was talking about the various evaluations of the situation of women on welfare and then in work, and was critical of those evaluations in the aspect that they didn't recognize the economic value of the time lost, and how, for example, when the person was on welfare, they were able to buy things on sale. But when they were working, they didn't have the time required. And there were many other examples like that. And in her estimation, that if you took that lost time into account, that they were actually worse off, even though the money income was higher. And I'm wondering if anybody can comment on that.
I want to make a very straightforward statement about this. The Congress passed this legislation. President Clinton really initiated the debate during the presidential election of 1992. Go back and look at his commercials. And the reason that he used it in his commercials, and the reason that a lot of people felt it was one of the major issues in his campaign, including Jason, who goes into this in some detail in the book, and the reason that Congress passed it on a huge bipartisan basis, bigger than the bipartisan vote for Medicare in 1965, is because the American people, despite everything you just pointed out, even if it's all true, they expect people to work. They do not think that people should be able to go on to welfare and have children outside marriage and raise their children supported by tax dollars. It's as simple as that. This is not a choice. So if someone wants to make an argument that, well, the mothers, they could look for sales and they could do a better job with their children and so forth, I really don't think it made any difference in the political debate. We wanted a system, the country wanted a system where people met individual responsibility, and that's what passed the Congress, and that's what we have now. And it's not going to change.
Maybe I misstated what I meant to say. What I meant to say was that this critique was saying that they overvalued the benefit that the women experienced when they went to work by discounting the economic value of the lost time. It was really, it's not anything about...
I can give you an example. Angie, the woman I followed, was eligible for food stamps. When you work, you have to turn in your wage receipts to verify so you know how much food stamps you're getting in. because she's working, she had less time to go to the food stamp office. She gets a notice from the food stamp office, says you have to come in to have your recertification done to see your worker. And then the next line says, worker's name, vacant. She was in what they called a vacant zone. I mean, she didn't have a worker. Her worker had gone on a leave of absence, so she had to contact another worker. Spends several months trying to contact a worker, can't ever get a worker. She gets cut off of food stamps. Now she doesn't have time to go to the office. She also doesn't have a car. She gets on the bus one day to go into the food stamp office, and the bus breaks down. So she wound up, in her case, not simply because she was working, but through a sort of cascade of bureaucratic problems, too, losing food stamps. So I think there's an example of where there was an economic cost brought on by the time loss involved in work.
Just two quick comments on this also. First, it's incredibly expensive to be poor. I mean, you have to, the grocery stores tend to be very expensive. You often have you do your laundry in a laundromat and so forth. Just very, very expensive. And when you add to that the fact that you have... Yeah,
David, Angie factored in every month, her rent was, I think, $450. She factored in $25 a month because she knew she was going to be rent. It was $25 a month was going to go to the late fee, just in service of your point.
There you go. But let me also reinforce one thing that Ron said, but then I reinforce something you said. I mean, people, I think at all sides of this debate, this wasn't about getting people off welfare mostly. I mean, getting people out of poverty. I wish it had been more about that. It was about work, because work was fundamentally American value and so forth. And the truth is, we don't hear about welfare fraud or welfare queens and so forth. It really has changed the way in which we fight about how much child care to spend and so on. So in that sense, it's good. That said, we need to do much, much more to support low-income working families. Whether people are a nickel or a dime or a dollar or $10 above the poverty line is not the issue. It's extremely, I mean, there are work expenses of all kinds of sorts. Some of it is lost time, but a lot of it is very real and out of pocket. So I think everybody on this panel, is my guess, believes we ought to do much more to support working poor families. I think the goal here is not to sort of say, well, let's get out of the work business, but rather let's make work really pay. Let's make sure if you work, you're not poor. Indeed, if you're working, let's make sure you're starting out on a ladder that takes you somewhere as opposed to spinning your wheels.
Thank you very much. I want to thank David, Ron, and Jason for a very stimulating discussion. And I want to remind you that Jason will be signing copies of his book. We're right out here? Right. So, thank you very much.